Chapter 1. 3. Well known that in modern times there is a religious institution whose wealth nobody knows of except God, and that is the institution of the Vatican, which established itself as a state within a state, and which has a material and religious influence on followers and non-followers around the world. The votive offering funds in the mosques of the Islamic countries collect billions which, if distributed fairly, would make the Muslim financially better off than his counterparts around the world. The clergy turn religious beliefs into commercial ventures to make profit, and so we have multiple approaches and doctrines which become something like commercial shops, each of them trying to promote his goods at the expense of the other doctrine, profiteering at the expense of the divine project, the worship of God and his transcendence, Almighty God, and they must stand to account before God Almighty on the day of reckoning, and there will be either reward or punishment. We find that the ancient Egyptians had the Book of the Dead that includes prayers, calls, and religious rituals. That was their primary book, which they used to worship by reading it. It includes etiquette, virtues, and morals, and it taught them to answer well before the court of account, with complete certainty in Allah and the last day. The ancient Egyptian religion and the morals and virtues it advocates were a fertile source from which they extracted the wisdom of the wise. Up to this day, it is still a source of quotes and wisdom from which they benefited. The illusions, the corrupt beliefs, and the crooked road the priests took, with the new names and gods they introduced over the years, contrary to God's teachings, stemmed from selfishness, domination, and the love of control. One cannot find a more eloquent statement than that in Surah Ibrahim, verse 28, 30-28. Hast thou not turned thy vision to those who have changed the favor of Allah into blasphemy and caused their people to descend to the house of perdition? 29. Into hell? They will burn therein, an evil place to stay in. 30. And they set up idols as equal to Allah, to mislead men from the path. Say, enjoy your brief power, but verily ye are making straight way for hell. Akhenaton began his famous revolution and his call for monotheism, the worship of one God, forsaking the worship of multiple gods. That call was almost crowned with victory had it not been for the plots of the clergy who stood against him. Akhenaton's message. Before you read this section, I recommend that you go back to my book, The Absolute Truth. It includes a section on the identity of the gods mentioned by pharaonic history and legends, which is, very briefly, the gods are angels sent by God to teach people the start of a new civilization after the end of a comprehensive civilization. Those angels used to teach and deal with the elite of people, the priests who were familiar with the affairs of religion and the world. They are also philosophers and teachers. It was a formality of sitting on the throne that one of the gods or angels takes care of the king. For example, the god Horus was in charge of King Mena of the First Dynasty in the year 3200 BC. The gods, Horus and Site, were in charge of King Hateb-Nabawi. The first was good, the second was bad. In the 19th dynasty, in 1304 BC, the gods Aser, Maat, and Re were in charge of King Ramesses II. In the same dynasty, King Tasert was under the charge of more than one god or angel who was Site Re, Merit, Amun. The priest used to convey Horus's instructions to the king to do or not to do. Thus the king became the bearer of the holy instructions, and the priest deludes him, making him believe that he has become the sole ruler on earth by the god's command, and the people had to worship the king. The priest, for his part, gave praise and glorification, exalting the king. The greater the glorification, the greater the reward. If you read the details of the king's donations to the priests in the Papyrus Harris, you come to realize the extent of the wealth of the priests of the temples and their power. They had slaves who were working in the private lands of the temples, and you cannot stop thinking about the great influence of that wealth on the state system on the one hand, and the minds and behavior of the common people on the other. The god Amun-Ra alone had exorbitant wealth, and the total area of his lands amounted to about 10% of the country's cultivated land. He also had 5 herds of cattle totaling at least 421,000 head. He had gardens across the length and breadth of the country, many of them in the oases, and he had gold mines in Nubia. In addition, he had 9 cities in Syria whose crops and taxes came to him on a regular basis. He had other resources, the most important of which is what the people and the kings provided and gave. No wonder, then, that the priests of Amun's temple or their predecessors and their successors had become the dominant power in the country's affairs and the people. The wealth of the temples accumulated for generations, and none of the pharaohs was in a position to take anything from it. On the contrary, everyone did their best to add to it in order to please the clergy, and in this way the pharaoh ensured their support. The Papyrus Harris gives us some idea of the state of chaos of the country at the time of Ramesses III. The poor people were on the verge of starvation, while piles of grain and gold accumulated in Amun's warehouses. The priests were the first to hear the cries of the starving people without any sympathy. We know from the same document that the clergy used to punish the poor. They earned money, and they wronged the people, especially when the power of the kings diminished and they became puppets in the hands of the clergy. The document tells us that finally the inevitable took place. The priests seized the throne and founded the 21st dynasty in 1080 BC, and the proclamation of the senior priest of Amun, Herihor, as king of Egypt. The priests became so powerful that they appointed employees in their posts, and they eliminated the authority of the courts, which became worthless. Every complaint was ruled by God. If someone accused another of something, the 2 rivals would go to the temple and put up a paper before the statue of the god, perhaps Horus or Amun, and the priest asked the statue to rule between them. Then the priest informed the litigants of the god's judgment, which was final and irrevocable judgment. You could only depend on one thing, which was convincing the priests of the temple before submitting your complaint and reviewing it before them. The way to do that was one and the same, which never changes. To prove that you were pious, offer the priests all that you could offer. The prosecution of the offenders, if they were so, was the outcome of the priest's fancy or the inspiration of the gods of the temples and their judgment as they alleged. In other words, there was no guarantee of justice at a time when the power of the clergy was absolute, and their injustice was predominant.